Some words, spoken centuries ago, still carry their weight and relevance today. Carl Jung, the great psychologist of the 20th century, left us with a warning that everyone should pause to consider. If you do not make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. At first glance, this may seem like a mere abstract philosophy, but in reality, it is an urgent and heartfelt reminder of what is happening within every human soul. It speaks of the existence of invisible forces, the parts we deny, the dark corners we do not wish to see. They don't vanish just because we ignore them. On the contrary, it is our denial that makes them stronger, silently and persistently, guiding every action, every decision, and even the fate of each person. Try looking back at yourself. Ask, how many times have you acted impulsively, angrily, or in ways that directly contradict the values you believe you hold? How many times have you said or done something, then regretted it, or couldn't quite understand why you reacted that way? In those moments, it was likely not your conscious choice, but the result of some invisible hand in your mind, a part of you that you do not want to acknowledge or face. This is what Jung called the shadow. The shadow may sound mysterious, but in truth, it is very familiar and close, though we rarely recognize it. The shadow is the sum of everything about yourself you dare not admit: selfishness, jealousy, secret desires, fears, deep wounds, painful memories, even dreams you've never told anyone. All of it gets pushed down to the depths of the subconscious in the hope that if you bury it deep enough, it will disappear. But the truth is quite the opposite. These things do not disappear. They simply lie dormant, waiting for you to lower your guard, to be tired, vulnerable, or to encounter stress or turmoil in life. Then the shadow emerges, infiltrating your thoughts, emotions, and reactions, leading you to act in ways you may not even recognize as your own. Maybe you've asked yourself, why do you keep repeating the same mistakes in relationships? Why do you often feel anxious, worried, or angry for no clear reason? Why do your dreams and good intentions seem to get sabotaged, delayed, or ruined by yourself just as they're about to come true? Most of these things originate from denied parts of the mind, from each person's shadow. The shadow does not arise naturally. It is a product of growing up, of social norms, Jung, of education, of lessons from family or community. From childhood, we are taught to be obedient, kind, self-controlled, not to be angry, not to be jealous, not to be selfish. These so-called bad emotions and thoughts don't disappear. They are simply suppressed, pushed deeper, denied. And so, bit by bit, Jung, the shadow is formed and grows within each person. Jung once said, the shadow is the person you would rather not be. Ironically, the more you try to deny it, the more the shadow is given a chance to control you from behind the scenes. It influences how you choose friends, lovers, careers. It determines how you respond to temptation, failure, even success. It can make you say things that hurt others, though you don't mean to, or sabotage your own opportunities without understanding why. Jung, the shadow, is also the cause of many personal tragedies, marriages falling apart, because no one dares admit their deep dissatisfaction. People who always see themselves as victims, but never look inward. Those who seem righteous on the surface, but secretly hide dark secrets. Obedient, gentle children who suddenly rebel, breaking every rule their family ever set. Do you see that the more modern society pushes us to be perfect, successful, and self-controlled, the more opportunities the shadow has to grow? When everyone wears a mask, trying to hide their ugliest parts, the shadow becomes a hidden force, quietly shaping each person's destiny. So, what happens if we continue to deny and avoid the shadow? It leads to loss of control, to inexplicable outbursts, to self-sabotage, to a string of repeated mistakes. It's that feeling of helplessness, stuckness, unable to move forward despite your best efforts. That's when we call it fate. But in truth, it's just the result of unconscious parts never brought to light. Jung's statement is not a pessimistic prophecy. On the contrary, it's an invitation to bravely look within, to face your own shadow. When you make the unconscious conscious, when you dare to acknowledge the denied parts, you truly take control of your life. You will understand why you act as you do, why you feel as you do, and most importantly, you will have the power to change, to grow, to truly mature. Recognizing the shadow is the first step in the journey to becoming whole. It is not easy, not something you can do in a day or a week, but a long process requiring courage, honesty, and patience. But only when you do it can you step out of the fate dictated by the unconscious and write your own story. Remember, the shadow is not your enemy, but the rest of yourself, the part you once rejected, hid, or ignored. When you are brave enough to look at it, you are no longer a victim of fate, but become the creator of your own destiny. So, if the shadow always exists, quietly shaping emotions, behavior, and even destiny, what is the way out of its control? Should we try to destroy the shadow, erase all darkness within to become pure and perfect? Carl Jung answered this long ago, with profound compassion for human nature. He did not urge us to eliminate the shadow, nor to push it deeper, because the shadow, like every other part of the soul, is a natural and inseparable part of who we are. Jung called the most crucial process of life integrating the shadow, that is, facing, accepting, understanding, and assimilating your darkness into consciousness. This is not surrendering to bad habits, nor letting instinct overpower reason. On the contrary, integrating the shadow is the bravest, most honest journey, and the only path to becoming whole. Imagine if you spent your whole life hiding, denying, or fighting your imperfections. You would always live in tension, guilt, and fear. Every time the shadow surfaces, through anger, envy, hurt, desire, you feel ashamed, self-critical, or try to suppress it even more. Life becomes a series of wearing masks, playing the role of the good person, the perfect person, for others and for yourself. But when you dare to sit down, to look directly at your shadow, admitting that you can be selfish, envious, have ugly thoughts, hurt others, something strange happens. You feel lighter, relieved, as if a huge invisible weight is lifted. That is the moment of true freedom. You no longer run from yourself, no longer tormented by negativity, no longer afraid of your own darkness. You begin to understand and empathize with yourself and with others. Integrating the shadow is not excusing bad behavior, nor indulging your instincts. It is recognizing, dialoguing with, and transforming the shadow's energy into more positive values. For example, when you recognize your anger, instead of denying or unconsciously lashing out, you examine its source. Perhaps it's an old wound, a feeling of being disrespected, a desire for acknowledgement. Once understood, you can express it healthily, turning anger into determination, motivation to defend your rights or to fight for what's right. Envy, so often labeled bad, is actually a signal that you too have dreams, desires, want recognition. When you accept this, envy can become motivation for self-improvement instead of festering into pettiness, destruction, or lingering insecurity. Another example, in creative arts, many great artists have been haunted by fear of failure, deep wounds from the past. But instead of running away, they accept and converse with their pain, turning it into inspiration, into the power to create and touch others' hearts. Integrating the shadow helps you mature in relationships too. Instead of blaming or judging, you learn to recognize your own negativity, understanding that everyone has a dark side, everyone deserves empathy. You stop believing in perfect people and learn to accept imperfection in yourself and others. Essentially, Jung, integrating the shadow is the journey to wholeness, a being made of both light and dark, but all seen, understood, and used wisely. That's when you are no longer unconsciously driven, no longer living in fear or denial, but consciously choosing, controlling, and developing yourself. This journey is not easy. Sometimes, facing your shadow is like looking into a mirror at midnight. You see everything you've hidden, feared, or felt ashamed of. It might hurt. You may want to turn away. But if you persist, you'll realize the shadow is not a demon, but a forgotten soul, a wounded child, a rejected dream, a vital energy buried out of fear or social norms. And when you embrace the shadow, you not only free yourself from fear and guilt, but also unlock a great source of strength, creativity, compassion, resilience, and true freedom. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Integrating the shadow is not just a psychological therapy. It is the truest, deepest, and most complete way of being. Only when you dare to face, accept, and integrate your shadow do you truly master your destiny, no longer lost in denial or self-deception, but living a whole, free, and empowered life. But why do most of us choose to deny the shadow? Why is it so hard to face our own known darkness, even though we know it's part of us, and that denial only gives it more power over our lives? The answer, in large part, lies in fear. Fear of being seen as bad, fear of judgment, fear of confronting emotions, memories, or desires deemed negative or unacceptable by society, family, or even ourselves. From childhood, we are taught to be good, obedient, self-sacrificing, never angry, jealous, or selfish. These bad feelings and thoughts do not disappear. They are just pushed deeper, denied from awareness. As we grow, the mask we wear thickens. Suppression and over self-control become habits. We learn to swallow anger, hide tears, pretend to be happy while hurting, even convincing ourselves we don't have those feelings. Yet the shadow does not vanish. It just waits for moments of vulnerability to surface. What are the consequences of denying the shadow? It leads to a half-lived life, always tense, conflicted inside. You may always feel anxious, never truly know yourself, always afraid of being exposed, of having your secrets revealed. You become a stranger to yourself, split between conscious and unconscious forces you cannot control. Those who deny the shadow often live in a cycle of suppression and outburst. They try to be patient, kind, forgiving, but all it takes is a small trigger, a word, an event, and everything suppressed bursts forth. Sudden anger, impulsive decisions, words that hurt others, followed by regret, self-blame, and renewed suppression. Others choose self-punishment, procrastinating, sabotaging themselves, refusing opportunities, not living true to their desires out of feeling unworthy or fearing judgment. This is why some people remain stuck in anxiety, depression, or low self-esteem, even if on the surface nothing seems wrong. Another common consequence is projection. When we won't face our own darkness, we tend to see it in others, then criticize, condemn, hate, or seek to control and fix them instead of ourselves. The more self-righteous one tries to be, the more likely they are to judge others for the very faults they cannot admit in themselves. A denied shadow can also draw us into toxic relationships, making us repeat patterns of pain. You might find yourself loving or befriending those who hurt you, or always ending up in unfair, disrespectful situations. This is the shadow expressing itself through unconscious choices, as if to force you to confront it, even if painfully. Not only for individuals, but denying the shadow creates far-reaching social consequences. When a group collectively denies, negativity, anger, envy, and fear get repressed together. Sooner or later, these erupt as violence, discrimination, conflict, or extremist movements. a way for the collective shadow to demand recognition and release. Perhaps the greatest consequence of denying this loose shadow is the chance to truly mature and be free. By always fleeing from darkness, we never fully know ourselves, cannot develop holy, nor create deep, authentic relationships. We become shadows of ourselves, living in fear and the illusion of perfection. Jung emphasized, what is not made conscious will appear in your life as fate. When the shadow is denied, it finds ways to emerge through failures, broken relationships, mental illnesses, or even violent, self-destructive behaviors. This is not a curse, but a natural mechanism forcing us to face, mature, and integrate all parts of ourselves. Thus, denying the shadow is not only rejecting a part of oneself, but also refusing the greatest opportunity, the chance for freedom and agency. Only by daring to face, admit, accept, and transform the shadow can we truly live a full, authentic, and happy life from within. We are not the first to recognize the existence of the shadow within the soul. For thousands of years, cultures, religions, myths, and the arts have depicted the shadow, the darkness in each individual, in many forms, as a constant reminder of human complexity. In Greek mythology, the shadow often appears as heroes destroyed by flaws they refuse to acknowledge. Achilles, invincible, falls to his weak heel, the one flaw he and the world ignore. Oedipus, in trying to escape fate, leads himself to tragedy, undone by the unconscious he cannot control. These stories are not just warnings about destiny, but lessons on the danger of denying our darkness. In fairy tales and folklore, the shadow is embodied by demons, dragons, witches, goblins, dark forces the main character must face, not avoid, but overcome through courage and honesty. Stories like Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf, Beauty and the Beast, or the prince who must descend to the underworld for his soul, are metaphors for facing and reconciling with the shadow. In modern literature, the shadow is even more vividly drawn. Consider Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, one man, two selves. Jung, a respectable doctor and the embodiment of all repressed desires and instincts. The more he denies Hyde, the stronger Hyde becomes, until he is uncontrollable. Or in The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, the portrait absorbs every sin, vice, and darkness Dorian denies until it destroys him. The shadow is not just a personal story, but part of collective psychology. In human history, countless times have repressed fears, hatred, and envy exploded into conflict, war, and violence. When a society is too focused on perfection, too harsh on mistakes, too afraid of difference, the collective shadow grows and eventually erupts in crisis. In modern society, the shadow is perhaps more subtle and powerful than ever. The pressure to succeed, to be good, to control oneself is immense. Social media allows everyone to craft a perfect image, stunning photos, success stories, symbols of happiness. But behind them are billions of anxieties, envies, fears of being left behind, loneliness, feelings of not being good enough, all pushed down into the collective shadow, finding outlets in online rage, cancel culture, and virtual violence. Scandals and moral crises in public life are vivid proof of the shadow's repressed power. The more a person or organization tries to appear spotless, the harsher they are on themselves and others, the more likely they are to be toppled by their own darkness. Politicians, artists, business leaders, once idolized as models, eventually fall into behaviors that betray everything they preached. These are not sudden falls from grace, but the inevitable results of a shadow denied for too long. Even in contemporary art, film, and music, the shadow remains an endless source of inspiration. Horror movies, anti-heroes, sad songs, all are ways for art to help us dialogue with our darkness, to recognize, feel, and finally transform it. The shadow, then, is not just a psychological concept. It is part of every culture, a reminder that humans are not only light, but also darkness. Only by facing and understanding the shadow can individuals mature and societies grow resilient, compassionate, and tolerant of imperfection. One could say, the whole history of humanity is a never-ending story between light and darkness, between striving for good and the journey to recognize and reconcile with the unfinished parts of every soul. If the shadow is the source of so much suffering, conflict, and tragedy, why did Jung insist that we must face and even integrate it into our lives? Perhaps within the shadow, besides fear, lies something else, something we often miss when we only try to run away. The answering the shadow is not just a storehouse of the negative, but also a reservoir of untapped potential, of strength and creativity each person possesses, but seldom dares to admit. Look at yourself or those around you. Have you noticed that the strongest emotions, anger, envy, fear, longing, when understood and transformed, become huge motivators for action, creativity, and change? Someone haunted by fear of failure, if they face it, can turn it into determination, attention to detail, and persistence. Someone jealous of another's success, if honest, will see it's a longing to rise, to learn, to improve. In art, the shadow is an endless well of inspiration. Great writers, musicians, and painters have all plunged into sorrow, loneliness, personal wounds. If they only denied or avoided these, they would never have created their masterpieces. By facing the deepest pain, by conversing with the shadow, they transformed emotion into beauty, into meaning for humanity. Sad music, fierce paintings, etching novels, all originate from shadow experience. In daily life, the shadow is also the hiding place for qualities we buried out: fear of judgment, boldness, unconventional thinking, desire to lead, will to change, creativity beyond the mold. Sometimes it is denying these parts that keeps us content, afraid to break out, living always in the comfort zone, self-limited. But if one day you have the courage to look inside, to accept even your wildest dreams and secret ambitions, you open the door for your true potential to emerge. The shadow is also the source of compassion. When we understand our own pain and imperfection, we become more empathetic to others. Someone who has experienced failure, loss, and faces it can share, empathize, and inspire others navigating darkness. It is contact with the shadow that deepens, matures, and turns us into guides for others. Jung said, "In the shadow, not only bad things, but also unlived potential dwell. If you face it, you'll find strength, creativity, courage, and willpower you never thought you had." That's why many people only break through and succeed after great upheaval, because they must face their deepest shadow and use that energy to be reborn, to move forward with greater power. Integrating the shadow is thus the journey of liberating your greatest potential. It is not an easy path, but it is the only one leading to inner freedom and a meaningful, fulfilled life. When you dare to look into the darkness, you do not just overcome fear, you reclaim the strength, passion, and creativity buried within. That is the greatest gift gives to those brave enough to face and harmonize with it: growth, freedom, and a new, stronger, more complete source of life energy. If the shadow is both the source of pain and the reservoir of potential, why do people and society so often fear, avoid, and try to deny it? This fear is not only rooted in personal instinct, but is also reinforced and shaped by the very rules and norms that communities build. From childhood, we are taught what is right and wrong, what is good and bad, which behaviors and feelings are acceptable and which must be hidden or eliminated. A child who gets angry, jealous, or shows selfishness is often scolded, labeled as naughty, not good. So, the child learns to suppress emotion, to hide what doesn't fit parental, teacher, or social expectation. Over the years, the shadow grows, as does the fear of being exposed. Society tends to exalt perfection, standards, control. We are encouraged to show off achievements, virtues, happiness, while failure, mistakes, sadness, anger, all are seen as weakness, as things to hide. At school, at work, Jung, even in close relationships, few dare to reveal themselves fully, fearing ridicule, rejection, or judgment. On social media, this is even clearer. We easily construct a perfect version of ourselves, sharing only the good, hiding all flaws and imperfections. This not only deepens the personal shadow, but creates a collective shadow where everyone fears being different, being exposed, being excluded. Fear of the shadow also comes from our self-protective instinct. Facing darkness, thoughts, feelings labeled as bad, means breaking the image of yourself you have worked so hard to build. This can bring shame, guilt, even pain. To admit you have parts that are not beautiful or lovable. That's why many people choose denial, avoidance, or blaming circumstances or others instead of bravely looking within. The stricter and more extreme a society is about good-evil, right-wrong, the more likely people will fall into fear, over-control, or rebellion in moments of weakness. Religions or ideologies that overemphasize purity or perfection often inadvertently foster a bigger shadow, because anything that doesn't fit is repressed, labeled sin, temptation, evil. Fear of the shadow doesn't just make us strangers to ourselves, but creates a rigid society lacking empathy, creativity, and authenticity. When everyone hides their darkness and fears exposure, connections become shallow, while loneliness, suffocation, and pressure rise. Also, in fearing the shadow, many become harsh judges of others to reassure themselves, "I'm not like that, I'm better." Yet, Jung, criticizing and condemning others, is often just a way to avoid facing your own shadow. This is Jung's familiar projection mechanism. What we don't admit in ourselves, we see in others and try to exclude it from the group or community. In short, fear of the shadow is the fear of facing the truth, of shattering the illusion of perfection and accepting oneself as a being of both light and darkness. It's a very human, very natural fear, but also the biggest barrier to freedom, growth, and true happiness. Only by daring to overcome this fear, to look directly at the shadow, do we open the door to understanding ourselves, understanding others, and living a fuller, deeper life. After all this analysis and awareness of the shadow, the final and most important question remains, how do we recognize and integrate the shadow into our lives? How do we stop being controlled by it, stop living in fear or denial, and start actively guiding our own growth? This is not an easy journey, perhaps the greatest challenge a person may face in life, but it is also the only way out of living unconsciously, to become a free, whole being. The first step is always daring to look within. This requires absolute honesty with yourself, something that seems simple but is very hard to do. Ask yourself, when do you overreact to someone or something? When do you feel irritated, jealous, ashamed, or deeply hurt for no obvious reason? When do you repeat the same actions or make the same wrong choices even though you want to change? Such strong emotions, irrational reactions, endless life loops. These are all signs the shadow is seeking expression. Don't rush to judge or deny, observe, acknowledge, and ask her, what part of me is speaking? What am I really feeling? What am I avoiding about myself? Journaling, meditation, and self-questioning are valuable tools for starting this dialogue with your own shadow. The next step is admitting and accepting. Remember, no one is perfect. Everyone has a dark side, has had feelings or desires they are not proud of. Admitting you can be selfish, envious, angry, or weak doesn't make you bad or a failure. On the contrary, it's a sign of spiritual maturity. Only by facing it can you understand where these feelings come from and learn to control and transform them. You may feel fear, shame, or even pain when looking at the paths abandoned or hidden. Be patient. Every time you face a negative feeling, you move closer to inner freedom, freeing up energy once buried. Seeking support is also wise. Sometimes the shadow is so deep-rooted that you cannot recognize it alone or are too afraid to face it by yourself. In those cases, turn to a therapist, someone you truly trust, or a support group where you can share, listen, and receive companionship on your healing journey. Another way to recognize the shadow is by observing projection. Notice what you hate, judge, or cannot tolerate in others. Often, that is exactly what you haven't accepted in yourself. When you realize this, instead of continuing to criticize, ask, what am I seeing of myself in this person? What do I need to learn from this feeling? After recognition and acceptance, the final and most important step is to integrate and transform the shadow. This does not mean letting the darkness dictate your actions, but learning to understand and use its energy in healthy, creative ways. Anger can become the drive to protect yourself or fight for what's right. Envy become the will to rise and improve. Fear can remind you of boundaries to overcome. Art, creativity, sports, meditation, or connecting with nature are wonderful ways to channel the shadow's energy. Rather than let it destroy, you can turn it into strength, inspiration, and emotional and spiritual growth. The most important thing on this journey is courage and patience. No one can integrate the shadow in a day. It's lifelong work, a continual journey of self-awareness, self-adjustment, and development. There will be times you stumble or want to quit, but remember, each time you look within, each time you accept a piece of darkness, you move closer to freedom and wholeness. This journey not only helps you live authentically, but also deepens understanding and compassion for others, because you know everyone has an unfinished part. Everyone is fighting their own shadow. That's the foundation for deep, genuine, lasting relationships. And finally, only when you dare to step into the darkness, to converse with it, do you truly find the light of understanding, maturity, Carl Jung, and an endless source of inner strength you might never have known. After all we've explored on the journey of understanding the shadow, from recognition, facing, to integration and transformation, we realize a simple but profound truthing. Each person is a sum of light and darkness, of strengths and imperfections. Holiness does not mean being flawless or without darkness or mistakes. Wholeness is daring to look at yourself honestly, accepting both light and dark, noble aspirations and hidden desires, successes and failures, fears, pain and weakness. It is when you no longer run, hide, or live in the illusion of perfection, but walk freely on your own path with honesty and courage. Jung said, wholeness is not about becoming perfect, but embracing imperfection. It is a lifelong process, moving forward, sometimes stumbling, sometimes hurting, but always persisting in self-dialogue, always learning, always growing. Every time you face a part of your shadow, you expand your awareness, become more mature, deeper, and more compassionate with yourself and others. When you accept your shadow, you are no longer a victim of inner conflict, judgment, or self-blame. You are no longer ruled by your past or negative emotions. Instead, you choose, create, and build meaning for your life. You become empathetic to others' pain, willing to share, inspire, and encourage, because you know everyone is on their own journey to become whole. Wholeness is not a destination, but a path. The path of honesty, courage, and compassion. It is the journey where we dare to face and love both our light and shadow. Only then can we be free, truly mature, and truly happy. Becoming whole is never easy, but every brave step on that path matters and is the deepest growth you can offer yourself. You do not need to be perfect. You only need the courage to be yourself, a real human being, of both light and darkness, of all that is beautiful and still unfinished. That is true wholeness, true freedom, and the real happiness you deserve.